How does a book manage to ignite a massive cultural movement while simultaneously alienating the exact people it claims it wants to persuade? Enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis. More than just a summary, which we also include, this feature examines how the author shapes argument, builds influence, and earns or loses your trust, giving you the tools to read with sharper insight and greater discernment. Should you read this book? This should help. Also excellent for aspiring writers. If you find this expanded format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback helps guide our future content.
You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
Today, we are taking a fascinating look at Richard Dawkins' highly controversial 2006 release, The God Delusion. And before we really get into the weeds here, I want to be crystal clear about our mission for this conversation.
Right, setting the ground rules.
Exactly. We are doing a 75% rhetorical analysis and a 25% summary of the text. We are maintaining strict neutrality today. We are not taking sides on the existence of God.
And we're not debating the inherent validity of religion itself.
We are impartially analyzing how the author constructs his arguments, relying purely on the provided critical analysis.
Right.
We're lifting the hood on the writing itself to see exactly how he builds his case. Okay, let's unpack this.
To really grasp the impact of this text, we have to transport ourselves back to 2006. I mean, this was a very specific post-September 11th cultural moment.
A completely different era of public discourse.
Absolutely. There was an intense, renewed focus on religious fundamentalism, particularly its political expressions operating within Western public life. People were anxious.
They were watching geopolitical conflicts driven by absolute ideological certainty.
And Dawkins was responding directly to what he perceived as a dangerous resurgence of faith-based irrationality. He was stepping into an environment that was already highly charged.
Looking to make a definitive, uncompromising statement.
He certainly made one.
He did. But before we get into the rhetorical strategies, let's look at the structure. For a reader picking this up, how does the book actually unfold?
Well, the narrative progresses as an organized, multi-front offensive. First, Dawkins spends time establishing his working definitions of religion, effectively setting the parameters for what he intends to attack.
Laying the groundwork.
Right. The text then moves into his primary arguments, evaluating the historical and scientific cases for and against the existence of God. Following that, events develop as he attempts to explain the evolutionary origins of religion itself.
Which is fascinating, asking why humans possess moral intuitions and religious tendencies at all if they weren't divinely given.
Exactly. And then the book transitions into outlining the specific societal harms caused by religion before wrapping up by constructing a purely secular defense of morality.
He's attempting to show that you don't need faith to be good. And look, on paper, that compartmentalized strategy certainly appears organized. It gives the impression of a systematic dismantling, moving from definition to origin to harm to alternative.
It looks perfect in a table of contents. However, as the critical analysis points out, the actual execution within those chapters is where things get really complicated.
Reviewers highlight some serious structural issues, right?
They do. Critics like physicist and theologian Mark Alford note that the arguments are often presented sloppily and incompletely. Dawkins frequently mixes entirely different lines of reasoning within a single chapter.
Blending things together.
Yeah, for instance, he will blend an argument about the historical accuracy of a text with a completely separate argument about the morality of believers. As critics emphasize, this obscures the logical flow for a reader looking for strict philosophical rigor.
Which brings us to the author himself. Who's the person wielding the pen? Richard Dawkins is an Oxford evolutionary biologist. He's the author of The Selfish Gene,
A monumental work in biology.
genuinely reshaped how we understand genetics. Furthermore, he is widely known as one of the founding four horsemen of the new atheism movement. So he brings a massive, undeniable scientific reputation to the table. When he speaks, people assume they are getting pure, objective science.
His scientific credentials lend him an incredibly strong technical ethos. I mean, he has legitimate, hard-earned authority when speaking about natural selection and evolutionary biology. And here is the critical distinction the analysis emphasizes. His authority does not extend to theology or the philosophy of religion.
That's a huge leap.
It is. This distinction matters enormously when evaluating the book's reach and its limitations. He is applying the tools of biology to philosophical and metaphysical questions. It's a bit like using a microscope to evaluate a poem.
It might show you the ink on the page, but it misses the actual meaning.
Perfectly said.
That sets up what might be the most fascinating paradox of the entire analysis. In the preface of the book, Dawkins explicitly states his goal is direct conversion. He writes, and I quote, "If this book works as I intend, religious readers who open it will be atheists when they put it down."
He explicitly wants to change minds.
So if his stated goal is to convert the religious, why did this book end up sitting almost exclusively on the nightstands of convinced atheists?
What's fascinating here is that the analysis reveals a massive disconnect between that stated intention and the actual result. Despite his claim of wanting to reach the devout, his actual audience ended up being quite different.
The choir he was already preaching to.
Essentially, yes. The book resonated overwhelmingly with secular-leaning agnostics, doubters, and already convinced atheists. These were readers seeking intellectual validation for beliefs they already held, rather than believers experiencing a genuine persuasion.
Plus a secondary audience of cultural observers just watching the new atheism movement unfold.
Right, watching it as a sociological phenomenon.
It sounds like he built a rally for the home team, rather than a bridge to the opposing side. And the critical breakdown suggests this disconnect comes largely down to tone.
Tone is everything here.
The book is heavily reliant on emotional appeal, but the tone is fiercely confrontational, witty, and frequently contemptuous. To give you a direct sense of the language, Dawkins describes the God of the Old Testament as, and again, quoting here, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
That is not the language of someone gently trying to persuade a hesitant reader.
Not at all.
That is the double-edged sword of the entire book. That emotional register makes for an incredibly entertaining read, but rhetorically it is a massive trap. He uses incredibly vivid analogies, like comparing belief in God to a belief in the tooth fairy.
Or the satirical flying spaghetti monster.
Yes. For a skeptical reader, that razor wit and evangelical fervor create an emotionally galvanizing experience. It feels victorious.
But for the devout reader, he claims he wants to convert.
For them, that same passion tips repeatedly into mockery. As the analysis points out, this ultimately hardens the opposition. When a reader feels insulted, their cognitive defenses immediately go up.
It completely alienates the very audience he states he is trying to reach in the preface.
Persuasion requires a baseline of mutual respect. The critics note that the text abandons that respect very early on.
Before we dive into the core logic of the book, take a second to check out Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques inspiring reflection and rational thought.
So we know who he was talking to, and we know his tone was incredibly biting. But if we strip away the sarcasm, does the actual logic hold up?
Here's where it gets really interesting. Dawkins builds his case around a central logical argument that he calls the ultimate Boeing 747 gambit.
This is the absolute linchpin of his book.
Let's break this down. The premise asserts that invoking God as a designer to explain the complexity of the universe is a self-defeating argument. His logic is that any being capable of designing something as complex as our universe must, by necessity, be even more complex than the universe itself.
So invoking God does not solve the problem of complexity.
It just creates a bigger problem, because now you have to explain who designed the highly complex designer.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see why this argument creates such a massive divide among reviewers. Against a naive, anthropomorphic version of a deity, a sort of human-like builder in the sky creating planets the way a mechanic builds an engine.
This Boeing 747 gambit is a genuinely compelling logical point.
It absolutely is. But critics point out he completely ignores classical theism.
We aren't talking about a man-in-the-sky deity here.
Yeah.
What exactly is classical theism arguing in response?
In classical theism, and here we are talking about the philosophical tradition of thinkers like Thomas Aquinas or Anselm, God is not viewed as just a very complex thing sitting inside the universe who requires a prior cause.
So, not a mechanic.
Not at all. Instead, God is defined philosophically as a necessary being. Think of it as the uncaused first cause, or the sheer act of existence itself. By definition, a necessary being requires no prior explanation.
It is the ground zero of reality.
Exactly. So when Dawkins demands to know who caused God, critics argue he is completely missing the foundational premise of classical theology. It is like asking, what is north of the North Pole?
The question itself misunderstands the geography.
Precisely.
The analysis also points out that his logical structure constantly conflates two completely different things. He constantly mixes arguments against the existence of God with arguments against the harmfulness of religion.
Which are two entirely distinct logical questions.
Whether a belief system is true and whether a belief system causes societal harm, those are different. but the text blurs them together to build momentum. Just because an institution has caused harm does not automatically disprove its metaphysical claims.
And vice versa. That blurring of lines leads right into the specific logical fallacies identified by the reviewers.
Let's run through those.
The critical analysis details a rapid-fire deployment of several rhetorical pitfalls. First and foremost is the straw man fallacy. As we just discussed, Dawkins targets easy, fundamentalist beliefs rather than engaging with sophisticated theology.
As one critique noted, he targets a God that many believers don't believe in either. Does he ever acknowledge that he might be taking the easy way out by ignoring the heavy philosophical hitters?
He actually anticipates this objection in the text. He brings up the hypothetical sophisticated believer who says his definitions are too simple, but his response is simply to dismiss the objection as tedious.
Just tedious.
That's the word. The analysis highlights this as a significant rhetorical move where he sacrifices intellectual generosity in favor of combative wit. It keeps the pacing fast and entertaining for his primary audience, but it entirely abandons logical rigor.
Then we have the ad hominem and ridicule fallacies. We touched on the tone earlier, but the analysis points out that spending half a page listing inflammatory epithets to describe a deity and heavily mocking the believers themselves is a classic evasion of logical debate.
It replaces the difficult work of dismantling a philosophical argument with an emotional attack.
Highly effective for riling up a crowd, but terrible for actual debate. Next, the reviewers highlight his use of the genetic fallacy. How does he employ that here?
The genetic fallacy is a crucial one to understand for this analysis. Dawkins uses evolutionary psychology to explain the origins of religion. He argues that our moral intuitions and religious tendencies are simply evolutionary byproducts.
Perhaps they helped early human tribes survive by fostering group cohesion.
Sure, the fallacy occurs when he assumes that explaining the origin of a belief automatically disproves its truth claims.
So just because I can explain the neurological process of how your brain perceives a tree, that does not inherently prove that the tree itself does not exist.
Exactly the right analogy. Explaining the evolutionary mechanics of human perception does not invalidate the reality of what is being perceived. But the text treats the psychological origin story as a definitive metaphysical debunking.
The review also highlights his use of a false dichotomy. The text frequently implies that science and the concept of God are entirely mutually exclusive in all possible formulations,
Forcing the reader into an absolute corner,
you must choose the rational light of science or the dark ignorance of faith.
which completely ignores the vast number of scientists who hold religious beliefs or the philosophical models that seamlessly integrate the two.
Throughout all of this, he leans heavily on intertextuality, weaving in references to Charles Darwin and relying deeply on the philosopher Daniel Dennett. Specifically, he uses Dennett's concepts of skyhooks and cranes.
We should define those for anyone who has not read Dennett.
What are skyhooks and cranes in this context?
Dennett uses these as metaphors for how complexity arises. A crane is a natural process that builds complexity from the ground up, resting on a solid foundation.
Like natural selection.
Natural selection is a crane. A skyhook, on the other hand, is an imaginary hook hanging from nothing in the sky, used to explain something we do not understand. Miracles or divine intervention are skyhooks.
Dawkins uses these metaphors to argue that science provides real cranes, so we do not need imaginary skyhooks.
Exactly. This intertextuality serves as the philosophical backbone of his entire case, creating a dense network of scientific associations that bolster his authority, even when he drifts far away from pure biology.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most important question of the whole analysis. After all the analogies, the scientific explanations, the skyhooks, and the heated rhetoric, did the book actually succeed?
This raises an important question indeed. That requires us to separate information from understanding. The analysis makes it clear that the raw information Dawkins provides regarding biology, evolutionary history, and even the history of religious violence is largely sound and very well cited.
So the foundation of facts is there.
Because of that, the God Delusion succeeds brilliantly as a work of cultural persuasion. It became one of the best-selling nonfiction books of its decade. Many people cite this exact text as the turning point in their personal journey away from faith.
On a purely metric level of real-world impact and sales, Dawkins achieved a massive victory.
So what does this all mean for you, the reader? The analysis adds a major caveat to that victory.
It means you have to recognize what the book is and what it is not.
As a work of philosophical rigor, the critical consensus suggests it falls remarkably short. A fascinating comment from a Reddit debate community captured the dual nature of the book perfectly. They stated it is more rhetorically powerful than philosophically rigorous,
Dawkins provided a highly valid and devastating argument against a God of the gaps.
which is the idea of using God merely to plug holes in current scientific knowledge.
But dismantling a God of the gaps isn't the same as dismantling religion as a whole.
That is the ultimate takeaway. What the book truly provided was a cultural permission structure. It gave a generation of educated Westerners the rhetorical ammunition, the razor-sharp wit, and the evolutionary authority to publicly and passionately reject religion.
But it did so without ever genuinely wrestling with classical theology's heaviest hitters.
Right. He sidestepped the truly difficult arguments. He completely bypassed the cosmological argument from contingency.
The question of why anything exists at all rather than nothing.
He ignored the ontological argument, and he brushed past the fine-tuning arguments of the universe.
The fine-tuning argument proposes that if the fundamental physical constants of the universe were altered by a fraction of a hair, life could not exist, which theologians argue points to a designer.
The analysis shows that rather than debating these deep philosophical frameworks, he stuck to his evolutionary strengths and his biting sarcasm.
It was a rhetorical masterclass in mobilizing a specific demographic.
But it achieved that mobilization through profound philosophical shortcuts.
It is a phenomenal case study in the difference between winning an audience and winning a debate. You can write a bestseller, ignite a global conversation, and shift the cultural landscape, all while leaving the actual foundational arguments of your opponents completely untouched.
Before we wrap up today's analysis, let's look at the foundational premise one last time. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, one that stretches beyond the specific arguments in the text.
Go for it.
The book relies heavily, almost entirely, on evolutionary biology to explain how biological complexity arose over millions of years. And from that explanation of how the mechanics operate, it draws the conclusion that no God is needed. But evolutionary biology, as a magnificent and rigorous discipline, was never designed to answer the deeper underlying metaphysical question. Why is there something rather than nothing at all? Science is an incredible tool for mapping the mechanics of the universe. But where do we turn to answer the questions that science simply isn't built to ask?
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary, subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
We hope you enjoyed the deep dive.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.